I'm going to start by saying 50 years ago, I moved from Wisconsin. I almost said it correctly, from Wisconsin, there we go, that was better, to Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is, you know where it is, adjacent to the northwest quadrant of Washington, D.C. A move from a Midwest suburb to a real-time city. Now, it didn't occur to me that I would be living just a few miles from the nation's capital the time of the bicentennial. And I was in for a patriotic treat. Oh, by the way, is anyone else here this morning who can raise your hand with mine and say, yes, I remember the summer of 1976? Okay, I'm not alone. All right. Some of you can. Well, at first when I got there in Tacoma Park, I didn't know how to navigate 495, I-95, or the George Washington Parkway. Going from country driving to city driving, that was a steep learning curve. And then this was pre-metro days, so parking was a lot easier to find at the National Mall. And I remember standing there at the Lincoln Memorial, looking across the reflection pool and noticing the Washington Monument and the U.S. Capitol all were in a line with each other. And that was one of those times I'd call a patriotic treat. And one evening that year, I sat on the steps of the Jefferson Memorial with the tidal basin as a backdrop, listening to the U.S. Army Concert Band. That was a cool patriotic treat. And there were times when I just drove to the National Mall just to absorb our heritage. I was amazed I could even park my car in front of the White House South Lawn. So I felt those patriotic warmth things coming up in my mind. We're now 1 week away from singing Happy 250th. Now, we all know this nation is not perfect. You and I most likely don't agree with many events and politics that are shaping our political landscape. Yet, we can still freely worship. The state doesn't tell us everything that we can and can't do. And we have opportunities of work and travel. By the way, have you noticed what many Europeans who are visiting the United States for the World Cup tournament are discovering what we already know about the USA? Have you watched any of those things on YouTube? It's kind of interesting. They talk about our natural beauty, the abundance in our stores, Walmart, Costco, and Buc-ee's. They can't believe that's a gas station. You buy petrol here. You can buy everything else at Buc-ee's. And then the ease of travel and the friendly greetings. And even the people from the UK love the ranch dressing. Did you hear about that? Yeah. In fact, TSA has told them, listen, you guys, put all of your ranch dressing not in your carry-on. It won't go through, you got to put it in your suitcase and your check-on. I read an article just the other day by Becca Blonde, B-L-O-N-D. It appeared on a news feed, and she made this observation. The United States of America may not have deserved the World Cup, but the USA needed the World Cup. She continued, the tournament feels completely void of hateful rhetoric and leaders sowing division for clout, noting that people have been yearning for the goodness to cling to. She ended her piece with these words. This really struck me. The World Cup came to America, and for a little while, the world looked less like a map and more like everyone had come over to the same house. Isn't that interesting? Well, it's a blessing, is it not, to live in the United States of America? Which leads me to say, we are blessed and we must be a blessing. And I appreciate when we begin our Rotary meetings by saying the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, followed by prayer. I am moved to tears when I hear a patriotic hymn sung with meaning and passion. Are we not living in the land of the free and the home of the brave? Which leads me to say, dear Lord, please, may we be a blessing. And I believe God, with his hand, led our founding fathers to establish a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and that by his continued blessing it shall not perish from earth. On July 5th, not the 4th, on July 5th, 1776, copies of the Declaration of Independence signed the day before were being distributed to government and military leaders to be posted and read in public places. And when we say July 4th is the birthday of the USA, we're remembering the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson from Virginia drafted the 1,300-word document with input from John Hancock and Benjamin Franklin. But it was John Dunlap, the official printer for the Continental Congress, an immigrant from Ireland, worked all night to have about 200 copies of the Declaration of Independence ready for distribution on the morning of July 5th. And the Declaration begins with a powerful statement, which clearly puts God eternal front and center. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are what? Created equal. And that we are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That word unalienable means you can't change it. It's there. Unalienable rights, that among these are what? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It seems to me our founding fathers believed what the psalmist wrote. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Now, too often we stop with the first sentence. But notice with me the last sentence. It too is powerful, which holds on to a statement of belief. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor. That's powerful. 5 signers of the 56 that signed it were captured by the British as traitors and suffered torture before they died. 12 signers had their homes ransacked and burned. 2 of the signers lost their sons in the Revolutionary Army, and 1 had 2 sons captured by the enemy. And 9 of the 56 fought and died of wounds or physical hardships of the war. I am reminded that all gave some, and some gave all. Our founding fathers must have believed what the psalmist wrote. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. And we can ask ourselves the question, how many of those 56 signers were Christian? Some estimates say 50 to 55, 54 to 55, but many of them carried Enlightenment views, which favored rationalism and reason. Many of them were deists. And a deist believes that God created the world and then left it alone to run its own course, much like winding up a clock and setting it into orbit. But these men were still members in Christian denominations like Anglican, Congregational, or Presbyterian. However, they must have been acquainted with the scriptures and understood the words of the psalmist. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. By the way, do you have any of those patriotic moments, or am I the only one? As I mentioned, when I hear the Star-Spangled Banner sung with passion, my patriotic heart is moved. And you know the words, they came from a poem written by Francis Scott Key in 1814. It was 102 years later that President Woodrow Wilson signed an executive order to make it our national anthem. And then in 1931, President Herbert Hoover signed a public law that had made it the official national anthem. By the way, The Pledge of Allegiance was originally written by Francis Bellamy in 1892. Bellamy was an American Christian Socialist Baptist minister and author, and it was 50 years later, in 1942, that Congress formally recognized the pledge and included it in the U.S. flag code. And then 3 years later, in 1945, Congress officially adopted the title, the Pledge of Allegiance. Then, in 1954, the words were added, under God. Isn't that interesting? To kind of see how this has come about. These weren't done, back when the founding fathers made everything. This kind of understanding has come so that even in 1954, our government leaders must have believed what the psalmist wrote. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. These things that often stir our patriotic hearts came decades after 1776. The phrase, in God we trust, first appeared on a 2-cent U.S. coin during the Civil War in 1864. In God we trust became our official motto on July 30th, 1956, when President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the joint resolution of Congress and put it into law. This phrase replaced the motto, E pluribus unum, Latin for out of many, one. The same act mandated that in God we trust be printed on all U.S. paper and coin currency. In October of 1957, the first paper dollar bills bearing the motto entered circulation. Now this is very interesting. The push to make this our national motto was largely driven by anti-communist sentiments during World War II, which intended to distinguish the United States from the godless Soviet Union. Did you catch that? It was put there on our money for that reason. Even in 1957, our government leaders believed what the psalmist wrote. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. And I say to you this morning, to all of us, if there ever was a time for Christians to live our national motto, now is the time. In God we trust, in God we must. By the way, the opening ceremony for the U.S. Capitol Visitor Center occurred on December 2nd, 2008. The center took nearly a decade to plan and build. A replica of the Statue of Freedom, which sits on top of the Capitol Dome, stands in the background of the Center Hall. You can see it there in the picture. And notice above the hall entry, you can barely see it on this slide, but there in gold letters, it says, in God we trust. That was 2008. 42 years ago, in 1984, President Ronald Reagan believed what the psalmist wrote, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Follow along as I read what he said. Without God, there's no virtue because there's no conscience. Without God, we're mired in the material, that flat world that tells us only what the senses perceive. Without God, there is a coarsening of society. And without God, democracy will not and cannot endure. If we ever forget that we are one nation under God, then we will be one nation gone under. That was 1984. But today, our national house is too divided. The left hates the right mocks the left. North versus south, East Coast, West Coast, country living versus metropolis living, progressive versus traditional, Republican versus Democrat, capitalism versus socialism, secular versus Christian. And are we trying to stand in this divided house? There's road rage, teen takeover, society is melting down, violence in our streets, advancing war zones, political collapse, government fraud, economic swings, ethnic tensions, displaced people, morality and common sense have long been tossed out the window. If there ever was a time for Christians to live our national motto, now is the time. In God we trust, in God we must. And by the way, these events that we see around us do not cripple God. His love isn't handicapped by crime. His generosity isn't stifled by global greed. His compassion isn't halted by hatred. His law is not erased by lawlessness. These events do not cripple God. His prophetic plan is not failing, it's unfolding. In God we trust, in God we must. And what did the psalmist declare? Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. The word blessed means happy. So we can then say, happy. Happy is the nation, or that such a nation's condition is desirable. Think about it. But what makes a nation a nation? Well, to some degree, it's the government, I get it. But the real making of a nation is what? The people. We, the people. Does that make sense? Of course. Our church, Valley Fellowship, is a church not because of the sanctuary in this building. This is a church because of you. We, the people, make the church a church. Our nation can only be blessed or be happy or become a desirable place to live when we, the people, make God our Lord. To put it simply, in God we trust, in God we must. And the people, the body of Christ, we must be the visual example of what it means to be a blessed people whose God is the Lord. Last Sabbath, I had a conversation with my friend Tom. He comes to our church, but by membership, he's a Lutheran. And he was telling me, some of you have been to Tom's barn. It's out in Connicksville. He's planning on the first Saturday in August to have a gathering, a Christian gathering. He calls it Good, Clean Christian Fun for the family. He'll have a Christian band there. They'll be preaching and there'll be food. And he just wants it to be a place for families to come and have a positive Christian experience. But too many of our churches, he told me, exist in their own little bubble. He's gone around, and by the way, there's a church right up the hill from his barn. He's gone around to local churches and said, please, would you come? Would you participate? Would you mention it to your folks? And you know what? Every single church has responded with no answer. And he told me, he said, you know, Pastor Buzz, too many of our churches exist in their own little bubble. It's good to love people within the church family, but there are other people. We talked about some of the other ones this morning that fell out in front of the restaurant. There are people who are not in our church circle and who are even in other churches that need to be loved by you. God has blessed us, which means we are to turn his blessing and let it be a blessing to others. This little blessing of mine, I'm going to let it shine. You know, I like to go, when I remember, to visit Emmanuel's ground. And Vita's there, not always on Tuesday or Thursday morning, but she's there a lot, helping out. And I went there a couple Tuesdays ago, and Mindy is so gracious. If you have not been to Emmanuel's ground, you need to go. That little garden, well, it's actually a big garden, kind of on the backside of the Academy property. And Mindy, we got some vegetables, and she said, Pastor Buzz, I got all these flowers here. Why don't you just take one and give it to somebody? Okay. So I took the little jar with the flowers that are growing there at the garden, and I said, well, I'm going to give it to my neighbor. I have a neighbor, several, who about a month ago, Dell, her mother, passed away, and her mother wanted me to do the funeral service. They are members of Bethlehem United Church of Christ. And so I did the funeral service. And I thought, I'll give these to Dell. And when I stopped at Dell's house, the next door neighbor right across from her house is Gloria. And Gloria is 80-some years old and is physically deteriorating. She walks with a cane, and she's very sweet. In fact, to the former deans, we took some girls there this past year, and they made a meal for Gloria. Just a real sweet lady. And she was coming out her door, and I thought, she said hi to me. I thought, well, I better give these flowers to Gloria. And so I did. Last Sabbath afternoon, Gloria came to our house, walking, and she returned the glass jar that the flowers were in with a little thank you note. Yeah, it warmed my heart. Now I'm not perfect. I miss opportunities, but that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. We need to love people because that's what God has called us to do. You guys got it. You're doing it. But there's more. There's more. And there must come that point when you give them a cucumber, like a brother was saying, you got to say a prayer with them too. You know what I'm saying? There comes that point when, yes, we're doing all these nice things. Thank you, Jesus. Affirmation, keep it up. But at some point, we got to tell them about Jesus. Got to do it. Why? In God we trust. In God we must. I've learned a lot about Adventist history the last couple weeks. I was telling this to someone this morning. Probably about 70 years ago, what I just preached about wouldn't have been appreciated. There was a time in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, like many Christian churches, we didn't want to do anything with the government, with the state. I get it. The state is not perfect. And yet, what does Paul tell us? To pray for our leaders. By the way, Joseph and Daniel, where were they? They were right there in the government, right? Yeah. I don't think we can ever mandate values, but I think that we can have a Christian influence in government. I say that carefully, but you understand how I'm phrasing it. It wasn't until World War II that as Seventh-day Adventists, our attitude changed a little bit. I think it probably was a good shift because we realized that there should be some kind of civil duty that we do. For years we didn't want to even, in fact, during the Civil War, we didn't really get involved with fighting until Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves and made the Civil War focus more on abolishing slavery. And that's when our church leaders said, okay, we can get behind this, because Seventh-day Adventists were great abolitionists during that time. So it wasn't until about World War II, a little before World War II, when our church leaders said, what can we do? And we began to establish the Medical Cadet Corps so that our men, young men, would be trained to be medics. And of course, one of them received the Congressional Medal of Honor. The only non-combatant to ever get that, Desmond T. Doss. By the way, you know where he used to live? Lynchburg, Virginia. He's a Virginian. Come on now. All right? So it was that time there was a shift. And you think about it, that's kind of when Pathfinders got started. And what do we do with Pathfinders? Boy, we bring in flags. We say the pledge of the flag. We say the pledge, the Pathfinder law, and the pledge. We put that all together. And so it was somewhere around that time where our mindset shifted a little bit. Some people are uncomfortable with that, and I respect that. But also, as I've mentioned, I've seen throughout Scripture, there are places to be involved and to be influenced in government. Having said that, did you know that the hymn, the patriotic hymn, written by Catherine Lee Bates, she grew up in Massachusetts. Her father was a congregational minister. He passed away when Catherine was just a month old, less than a month old. She was raised by her mom and her aunt. Her brothers went to work to help support the family. However, Catherine was given an education. By the way, see, when she was born, 1859. When did the Civil War end? 1864. Okay? So this is the era. She's part of that kind of growing up in Massachusetts, which was, a non-slave state, part of the Union. And so she, by the way, women weren't allowed to so much to go to school then. Well, they could, but it was very unusual. So here Catherine goes to college. She gets a Bachelor's of Arts degree from Wesleyan College in Massachusetts, and she later becomes an English professor at her alma mater. Then in 1893, she traveled west to teach at a Colorado summer school in Colorado Springs. This is a Massachusetts girl. When she finished teaching, Bates and some of her colleagues decided to celebrate the close of the summer session by going on a merry expedition, in her own words, to the top of Pikes Peak. They made that ascent by a prairie wagon pulled by a donkey. And from on her perch, on top of that purple mountain majesty, Bates was able to look out over the prairie grasses and wheat fields of Kansas. And later she wrote, she was inspired by the sea-like expanse of the fertile country, under the ample skies, and the opening lines of that hymn floated back into her mind. She got back to the hotel in Colorado Springs and wrote the poem before she left Colorado. But she didn't think of publishing it until 2 years later. You know what hymn we're talking about? America the Beautiful. Was printed in a weekly newspaper on July 4th, 1895. Her patriotic words were soon set to music by popular composer S.A. Ward, a tune that he'd already written, and it's a tune we sing today. Celebrating country love and the patriot dream, the song still resonates with Americans from all over walks of life. Bates' experience as a reformer and her frustration with the inequalities of American life also made the way into her poem. One of the lines says, America, America, God shed his grace on thee. And originally the version said, till selfish gain no longer stain the banner of the free. That's powerful. Within 20 years, after revising some of the lyrics in 1904, Bates gave away hundreds of free permissions for America the Beautiful to appear in church hymnals and Sunday school songbooks of nearly all denominations. It's to be noted, the song was included in the 1941 version of the Seventh-day Adventist hymnal, hymn number 503, if you want to look it up. Before we sing that as a closing hymn, I just want to let us notice the words of that song, because I believe clearly it's a prayer. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties above the fruited plain. You can see her up there on Pikes Peak, right? It's not in our current hymn, though. This was the old one from 1941. Yeah, I don't know why we took it out. We did. Above the fruited plains, America, America. What is she saying here? That's a prayer, isn't it? God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with what? Do we need that? From sea to shining sea. Next verse. Oh, beautiful for pilgrim feet whose stern impassioned stress A thoroughfare for freedom beat across the wilderness. Can you see that? America, America. Oh, here's another prayer. God, mend thy every flaw. And look at this. Confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. Isn't that beautiful? Those are prayerful words. Another verse. America, for heroes proved in liberating strife, who more than self their country loved, and mercy more than life. America, America, may God thy gold refine, till all success be nobleness, and every gain, what? Divine, every gain from God. She's writing from a real, passionate heart for the Lord and for this country. In the last verse. Oh, let's see. There we go. Oh, beautiful the patriot dream that sees beyond the years an alabaster city's gleam, undimmed by human fears. America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. That's beautiful. That's a hymn. And we should not be ashamed to sing that. It's not saying America's great, but it's praying for God to bless America. And who makes up America? We, the people. It's a prayer for God's grace to crown my heart with brotherhood. It's a prayer for God's grace to give me self-control. It's a prayer for God's grace to give me that divine success. Divine success. Not man's or human success. It's not money. It's not fame. But it's God's success, which is character. So, I close with that. I can comfortably sing that song on Sabbath in church because it's a prayer. It's a prayer for this nation. As flawed as it is, there's still freedom we have. You know, watching some of those interesting videos of these Europeans, there's a girl back in France now. She's just come back from visiting the USA, watching the French soccer team. And she's in a car, and she's eating some bread. And all of a sudden it occurs to her, there's a law in France, you can't eat in your car while you're driving. And she goes through this whole list, and she says, you know, my country, France, is a land of no, no, no. But America, it's a land of yes, yes, yes. Wow. Think about it. We are still blessed. And let's take advantage, not misusing or abusing, but using those blessings to bless others. Now, we should sing the closing song now. Is that okay? Okay, we'll stand up. Should we use these words? Okay, I'll put them back.
Actually, I think he's got a slide deck that you can...
We'll just follow him here. Yeah. That's the last one. Here we go. Yeah.